We have 2 minutes to go, please, boys and girls. Can I ask you please to take your seats, members? Councillor Springett, Councillor Brindle. Right. Are we ready to... Right, good evening, members. I see we have no members of the public, so far as I'm aware. I am Councillor Dennis Spooner, the Chairman of the Planning Committee, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this adjourned meeting of the committee. May I take this opportunity to advise you that if the fire alarm system does sound, please remain seated, and members of the Democratic Services team will assess the situation and give further instructions on the evacuation of the building if necessary. As you will all know, tonight's proceedings will be webcast by the Council, and if anyone else is intending to record these proceedings, can you please let me know now? I ask this question not to stop you, but merely to ensure that members and other members of the public in the room and perhaps listening online know that this is taking place. As nobody has responded, I will take that as a no. I would also like to advise members that they should only address the meeting by way of their microphones and to remind them to turn their microphone off when they have finished speaking. The meeting may take longer than usual, as we found out last week, due to the COVID secure measures in place. I have received apologies from Councillors Eves and from Councillor Parfitt-Reid. Are there any other apologies? Looking round, I don't think there are. Item number 2 on the agenda, substitute members. I'm aware that Councillor Round.
Thank you. Substituting for Councillor Eves.
Thank you, Councillor Round. And Councillor Springett.
Thank you, Councillor Springett, substituting for Councillor Parfitt-Reid.
Thank you, Councillor Springett. Item number 4. Oh, sorry, item 3. Are there any visiting members? I can't see any. No. Item 4, items withdrawn from the agenda. There are no items withdrawn from the agenda this evening, so far as I'm aware. Urgent item 5, urgent items. I intend to take any verbal updates as urgent items, as they will contain further information relating to the application to be considered at the meeting. Now, disclosures by members and officers. Are there any disclosures by members? Councillor Springett?
I'm not sure if it's relevant, but I believe I was on Policy and Resources when they discussed the Trinity Foyer. I'm not sure if it's relevant or not, so I'll just make... Okay, that's fine, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Springett. Is there anybody else? Thank you for your guidance, Councillor English, much appreciated, as always. Disclosures, item 7, disclosures of lobbying. Could I please have any disclosures from members, if anyone has been lobbied? Councillor Brindle.
This is carrying on from last week, and it's the old Agenda 17, new Agenda 9.
Thank you for that. Anybody else? No. Thank you very much. Sorry, Councillor.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I've been lobbied in relation to Bicknor Farm, item 9, page 1. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Harwood. Moving on, item number 8, to consider whether any items should be taken in private because of the possible disclosure of exempt information. I move that the items on the agenda be taken in public as proposed. Is that agreed? Thank you. Right, agenda item 9, which is our first application to us to consider. I call upon Mr. James Bailey, Development Manager, to introduce the report. Thank you, James.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, bear with me. I'll just put the presentation. If I just share my screen, if we remember, although I'm in the room, I still have to present my screen through the Skype meeting.
Excuse me, James, can I just interrupt?
It was just a question whether members were intending to debate the item, because it was originally deferred because we understood Councillor Newton was coming to speak to this application, but he isn't here, and so it's now a starred item. So,
thank you, Councillor, and appreciate your advice. Councillor, whatever your name is, Mumford. I keep trying to call you by your first name, which I mustn't do.
yeah, I'd like it presented, please.
You would like it presented? Okay. Sorry for that, Mr. Bailey. Would you like to continue?
I would do, but my laptop looks like it's just stopped. Sorry, members, slight technical detail. My laptop decided to power itself down, so I've just got a new lead. So if you just bear with me for a minute or two, I should be able to resume the presentation. Thank you. Hello, members. I do apologise for that. I was getting a bit hot over here, thinking I wasn't going to be able to present to you this evening, but luckily we have, technology has been restored, and I can now present to you. So this is an application for listed building consent at Bicknor Farm, Sutton Road, Langley, for the demolition of a curtilage listed building at Bicknor Farm to allow for a new residential development granted planning permission under application 20500-713. So just going through the application details. So this is the application site. Sorry, ooh, bear with me. So I'm just going to go to the marker and the laser point. So this is the application site, access from the Sutton Road, and the building in question is just here. The building in blue is the main listed Grade 2 listed farmhouse, and the planning permission that granted the 7 units, I'll show you that later, extends to around this area, so it relates to the demolition of these farm buildings around the site, and that extends round here. So this is the layout of the approved planning permission for the 7 self-build units. So you can see the existing ragstone building which is forming this application is located in approximately this position here, which is right in the middle of this access road that provides the access to these 4 self-build units. So this scheme is not what you're considering, already has planning permission, and you're only considering the listed building consent for the demolition of the building. Just to give you, this is the Grade 2 listed farmhouse. Just some elevations showing you the character of the Grade 2 listed farmhouse. And what I should sort of set out, obviously members will know that the surrounding environments of this site have now almost been completely enveloped by residential development. I did have an aerial slide, and I can go through that if you wish to see that in terms of Google Earth, which shows you that obviously around the perimeter of the site it is now in the process of being constructed in terms of a housing site. So the whole site is now enveloped with residential dwellings. So it doesn't have the same characteristics as it previously had as a farmhouse with farm buildings surrounded by farmland. That situation has now changed. However, notwithstanding that, this is a curtilage listed building that we're considering, so it's not actually listed under the statutory register. But it nevertheless is a characteristic building, as you can see from the photographs. It's a ragstone building with brick quoin. Rather unfortunate additions, single-storey lean-to addition. And you'll see that as we go through the construction. So this is, as I say, this is the building in question. In terms of the report sets out, it's had unsympathetic additions added to it, i.e. UPVC windows. You can see the roof that's added on here as a subsequent addition. Obviously it's a clay roof, but it wouldn't have been, say, like the Kent peg roof that it may have had in its original time. And obviously there's no historic merit internally within the building, but it still has that kind of association with that linkage with the main farmhouse. Now the view of the building, and in the background you can see the buildings, the more modern day agricultural buildings that are proposed to be removed as part of the planning permission application that's been granted. So in terms of key considerations to consider, the report presented to members is a very balanced report, and going through some of the key considerations that members will need to consider tonight when they consider this application. Paragraph 190 of the MPPF requires the local planning authority to identify and assess the particular significance of any heritage asset, and this is set out in paragraphs 8.05 to 8.08 of your report, of the officer's report. Paragraph 193 requires great weight to be given to the asset's conservation, and in this stance you give the same weight to a curtilage listed building as if it was a listed building in that term. This is set out in paragraphs 8.09 of the officer's report. Paragraph 196 of the MPPF requires a balancing exercise to be undertaken, weighing the public benefits against the harm, which in this case is the loss of the listed building. The public benefits are assessed in paragraphs 8.12 to 8.17 of your report, with the balancing exercise being undertaken in 8.18 to 8.21 of that report. As you will see in the final recommendation, it is considered that the benefits arising from the application marginally outweigh the harm that results from the loss of the curtilage listed building, and that's on the basis that in terms of the requirement of MPPF, you are required to give great weight to the loss of that building. The report does go into detail that it's lost its significance and its connection with the listed farmhouse. It's got unsympathetic alterations and additions to it. Yes, planning permission has been granted and similar tests had to be applied, not the same test, but similar tests had to be applied in terms of the setting to the listed building under the Planning Listed Building Conservation Areas Act. But obviously you are now looking at the works on this application, which is the works, i.e. the demolition of the listed building. So as long as members apply that great weight to the conservation of this heritage asset, and then you go through that test that I've just effectively set out in a more simplistic form, you know, hopefully members will come to the same conclusion that officers. It is a very balanced recommendation, as I say, on this, because the public benefits do have to outweigh the loss. And thank you very much, Chairman. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. We don't have any visiting members, but we do have a member of the public. Okay, who I understand is on the call now. So, Miss Haddon, if you can hear us, we'd like to hear from you. Hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, thank you.
Oh, perfect, thank you. Am I okay to start?
Yes, please start. Your 3 minutes is just starting.
Thank you. Chairman, members, good evening. As members will be aware, this applicant obtained planning permission in October 2020 for the remodelling of an existing dwelling and the erection of 7 self-built dwellings with associated landscaping. During the determination of the application, a number of factors were considered, including the impact upon the listed building and any curtilage listed buildings. The Conservation Officer considered that the building subject to this application was curtilage listed, lying within the curtilage of the group.
Excuse me, Miss Haddon, can I stop you just for 1 moment?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Miss Haddon, please continue.
Where was I? The Conservation Officer considered that the building subject to this application was curtilage listed, lying within the curtilage of Grade 2 listed Victim farmhouse, but that its loss would be acceptable. However, this did require a listed building application seeking permission for the demolition of this building to be subsequently submitted, which is before you this evening. The building in question is a ragstone and brick building which is thought to have originated in the mid-to-late 19th century. It has undergone significant reconstruction with the addition of unsightly lean-to extension along with the insertion of modern materials, UPVC doors and windows and an asbestos sheet and 20th century tiled roof. It is in a generally poor and tired condition. It is agreed by officers that the significance of the building has been very much reduced through the unsympathetic alterations and extensions, and in terms of its siting, the building is not considered to have any clear functional relationship with the Grade 2 listed farmhouse. Therefore, its overall significance is considered to be very low. It is important to also note that the building cannot be seen from outside of the site, and as such, its benefit to the wider public is limited. It is not disputed that there would be an element of harm resulting from this proposal, but it is considered to be less than substantial harm and outweighed by the public benefits of the proposal in accordance to paragraph 196 of the NPPF. The public benefits of the proposal would be the provision of additional self-build housing in a sustainable location within the borough, job creation during the construction period and the benefits arising from the household expenditure created by the additional households. It is also considered that the proposals would result in a benefit to the setting of the listed building through the removal of the existing farm buildings which are of a poor appearance and their replacement with a traditional high-quality housing scheme that is more sympathetic and reflective of the character of the listed building. By way of mitigation, the applicant also proposes to reuse the ragstone material from the building in appropriate boundary wall locations within the scheme. On balance, it is therefore considered that the public benefits of the scheme would outweigh the harm resulting from the demolition of the building, and we hope that members can support the officer's recommendation. Thank you for your time this evening.
Thank you, Miss Haddon. And well within the 3 minutes, thank you very much. Now I have had indications to speak from Councillor Springett and from Councillor English and Councillor Mumford. So I'll take them in that order, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to play devil's advocate here, I'm afraid. I am assuming that the additions and changes to the listed building were not approved by Maidstone Borough Council. So therefore, technically, Maidstone could enforce and ask the owner to restore that building to its original condition, remove the lean-to, replace the windows, and then the argument that is being used to demolish this building, that it is ugly and has all these additions and all these changes, actually wouldn't apply. So the devil in me is saying, please don't add all these nasty bits on and then use them to justify demolishing what looks like quite a sweet little building. You could still put 5 self-builds on, renovate that building, and possibly 6 actually, just take out plot number 5 or 6, whatever it is, 6, and renovate the building. So my argument would be, I think somebody should ask the question of were those additions approved? I suspect they're not, and we should actually be looking at why they were done without permission. That's all I wish to say. Thank you.
Would you like to respond to that, Mr. Bailey?
Yeah, certainly. The difficulty that normally arises when you get to a Kirtledge listed building, in the sense that it doesn't sort of appear on a statutory register when you do a land search. So in terms of, you've had the Listed Building and Conservation Areas Act that came out in 1990 and established what is a Kirtledge listed building. Sometimes it's not quite so clear cut. So the difficulty that we would have with what you said, Councillor Springer, is we wouldn't know when those windows, doors, additions, etc. were put onto the building. In order to restore them back, we would have to serve a listed buildings enforcement notice, which at the end of the day, it is, as you quite, it is a criminal offence, a criminal offence on summary conviction to do works to a listed building without consent. However, there are extenuating circumstances, and in this case, it wasn't clearly identified in terms of Kirtledge listing. Is it reasonable to start serving a prosecution case against someone who might not have been aware that it was Kirtledge listed at that time? So there are a whole issue of problems that would arise if you try to go down a more formal route, i.e. either a prosecution or else a listed building formal enforcement notice. So I think that is an inherent problem were you to go down that route, and you might not be successful on that point to try and get the reinstatement of those original features that would have been there in the first place. So as long as members are aware on that point.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. And also the applicants are claiming that they don't consider the application or the building to be a curtilage building. So there is a dispute there as well. Councillor English.
Councillor Harwood may remember, I'm not sure anyone else will, but we had a planning application and a listed building application for a property in Old Lewes Hill a few years ago. And this council wanted to approve the planning application and turn down the listed building consent. We were told at the time in no uncertain terms that we should have taken account of the listed building issues when we determined the planning application, and that we couldn't, in fact, we could not reach a variant decision. Now, I need to be clear as to the legal position here, because we were told very clearly at that time that what the committee wanted to do, which was to reach a different decision on the listed building consent to the planning application, could not, in fact, be done. So I need to know that. Was the advice we were given then wrong, or can we actually make a variant decision?
Thank you, Councillor English. I must admit, I don't recall the case that you're mentioning, but I'm sure Mr. Bailey might.
I think Councillor Springett will remember it as well. I think it was Barty Farm, if I remember rightly.
This property was in Old Lewes Hill.
Oh, okay. Okay, I don't know about that one, but a similar situation arose in Barty Farm, yes. So I don't know in terms of the issue. But where it stands, you've got a decision under the Town and Country Planning Act 1990, and you've got a decision under the Listed Building and Conservation Areas Act 1990, two separate pieces of legislation. And technically speaking, normally you'd run the two in tandem, and you'd make decisions together on those, because if you grant planning permission and you've made the assessment, because you have to make a statutory assessment under the Town and Country Planning Act as the impact on the setting as a result of the planning application, and that's both set out in section 16.1 and 66.2, if I'm cool. I can bring the legislation up. So quite clearly, you have a duty to assess, in the planning application, the impact on the character and appearance and the setting under the planning application, and under the listed building, you've got a duty to assess the works on the character and appearance, because the listed building consent is all about works, not development, because it's not development to consider listed building consent. So on that point, you could reach a conclusion on the planning application that the planning application is acceptable, and you could reach a conclusion on the listed building that it's not acceptable for those reasons. Now, I say that because, strictly speaking, in legislation terms, that's what the legislation allows you to do. They're under two separate pieces of legislation. But, and there is a big but on this, the very fact that you've considered the planning application and you've considered your duty under the Listed Building and Conservation Areas Act, and actually what's set out in your report here, I think the officer actually quotes what was set out in the officer's report for the planning application, it may get to the point of, in terms of consistency, that an officer on a delegated report assessed that issue on the impact on the setting and concluded actually the demolition of this and the rebuilding would have a positive impact on the farmhouse. So then if you reached a different conclusion, I'm not saying you couldn't, but planning works on the basis of consistency, and in effect you'd be coming to a wholly different conclusion on a decision that we'd already reached. But I have said you could get to that conclusion because they're both assessed under different pieces of legislation. I hope that's clear.
So you're saying that Tony and I were right on that occasion, and we could have reached a different decision, and we were misadvised on this occasion, and we can actually turn this down if we so wished. And to follow Councillor Springett's point, whilst enforcement action might be tricky, if it's an unauthorised work, shouldn't the assessment start on the basis that it's an unamended building? Because it's unauthorised work, shouldn't you assess it on what it should be?
Yeah, please do.
Clearly, we don't know what was in there in the first place. So we would have to get to a point of saying, okay, if we're going to serve, and I'm taking you through the enforcement line, if we were to serve a listed building enforcement notice, which is what we'd have to do, we would have to specify clearly what we're requiring the applicant to replace those windows with. And the problem is, and I don't know if we got records to show actually what was in there in the first place. So that would be one stumbling block that we would come up against. The other issues we'd come up against, is it reasonable for us, because we have to apply the tests that when you're serving an enforcement notice, is it proportionate in terms of to take this action at this time? Is it expedient? Is it in the public interest? So every time we serve a notice, we would have to apply those relevant criteria. And given the fact that these works could have been done, I don't know when, could have been done a long, long time ago, is it reasonable, is it proportionate to require that listed building enforcement notice to go forward now? I think my view, and I'm here to advise members, I don't think it would pass the proportionate or reasonableness test to go forward on that basis, and I don't know what I would be asking them to replace it with. So I think that has inherent difficulties on that point.
Thank you. Can I just bring Councillor Springett back before I go to Councillors Perry
Thank
and
you.
Mumford?
I hear what you're saying, and I think on this particular application, possibly I have to put that to one side, but I think this is raising an important issue. You refer to Barty Farm, and I have to declare an interest because it affects my property. The sequencing of applications at Planning Committee can cause a committee to be forced into a certain decision. Hampton Barty Farm is happening now. We're being told the benefit of the houses outweighs the loss of a listed building. So it's not a discussion for tonight, but it's something I would like us to look at and perhaps be briefed or informed on, is the sequencing of how listed building applications and development applications are heard at committee and are considered. Because with the Barty Farm one, a decision was made on the listed building consent, and then when a discussion went on to the housing and someone tries to raise a point, they were told, no, that decision was made in the last application, you can't raise that now. So what I'm saying is I think perhaps we need at some future date to look at sequencing of things, because this is another one. We've approved the houses and now we're being put in quite a difficult position with a listed building. So I'm not going to say any more now, but I just want that on record. I think something perhaps we need to look at as councillors. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Springett. I have Councillor Perry, Mumford and then Brindle. Councillor Perry.
Thank you, Chairman. I read this very carefully, and I must admit I've struggled with this, I've got to say, because it talks a lot about balance, doesn't it? And it admits that there is a fine balance here. In para 821, it says on balance. And then when I looked at it, I think, well, this is about a curtilage listed building. I live in one myself, so I'm a little bit concerned about this. Now, when I looked at the benefits of this, I struggled actually to see what the benefits were, because if we look at the housing development, well, we meet our 5-year housing target at any rate. So in that sense, I struggled to see what in this particular context, because we're talking about pulling down a listed building, I struggled to see what the benefits were there. Then when I looked at it talked about employment and job creation. Well, yes, I accept that, but it is actually temporary, isn't it? It's only there while the houses were being built. So again, it's a fine balance. And when all's said and done, I actually felt that it's very important that we protect listed buildings, including ones that are linked. I live in a small area where we got the farmhouse, we got the original 18th century barn, which I live in, and we got the Oast House, and they are all linked. And this is very, very important. So I'm afraid I'm struggling with this. I don't think the benefits outweigh the what I would call the destruction of a listed building. And that's why I'm really not very happy about this at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Perry. Councillor Mumford?
Yeah, I also looked at this, which I hope everybody did. I'm told that it's a very balanced case. And I've got my conservation officer saying that there is harm to a heritage asset. Less than substantial harm, but that's a grade, a level of harm, which makes me carry out a balancing exercise between the public interest and also or public benefit and the harm. And so I look at this report, and if I go to the conclusion of the report, it says it's a very balanced case. The benefits marginally outweigh the harm. So I'm happy with that. So it's nearly subjective at this point in my mind, but I go backwards through the report and it says public interest, considered to be very low, or public benefit. So I venture back into the neighbourhood plan, and really all the neighbourhood plan does is support the NPPF in what it's trying to achieve. So I then end up back in the NPPF, which requires me any degree of harm to a heritage asset should be clearly and convincingly justified. Now, I don't think that's been done. It's a very balanced case. Well, that's not convinced me yet. And the NPPF also says that the heritage asset carries considerable weight and importance. So therefore, both the benefit and the harm have been graded low, but I am expected by the NPPF to give considerable weight and importance to the heritage asset. So because the benefits have not been clearly and convincingly justified, I'm going to propose, and that's under NPPF 194, I think, that the benefits have not been demonstrated to clearly and convincingly, whatever, you know where I'm going, you can word it, but that's where I am with it. I think the heritage asset should be given considerable weight, as it says in NPPF, because it's so balanced, so subjective. I think the heritage asset should be protected.
Thank you, Councillor Mumford. So are you actually moving that the application be refused? Sorry, are you actually moving that the application be refused?
Yes.
Thank you, Councillor Mumford. Do you have a seconder?
I'll second that if you want a seconder.
Well, I think Councillor Perry was second there. Do you wish to speak now, Mr. Perry, or Councillor Perry?
No, I've already spoken. You know my views on it.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Brindle?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Did I understand this building is in the way when it comes to the houses for which permission has already been given? Did I understand that in the presentation?
that is the case from what I can make out by
Okay.
looking at the...
So if this is the case, and should we refuse permission tonight, what effect will there be on the adjacent properties or those that already have permission? And secondly, a great steer has been given with regard to that there is nothing to preserve because it's all been modernised. And then I look at condition number 3, no work shall take place until a photographic and descriptive record, etc., so that we can conserve what is still there. I'm just a bit like Councillor Mumford, I'm just a bit unbalanced in that, because we're saying here we need to take a record of it, and yet we're being told there's not much there to save.
Thank you, Councillor Brindle. Mr Bailey?
Yeah, I'll start with the last point. With regard to the condition 3, it is good practice for us to, in terms of Historic England's guide, that if you do consider that the benefits outweigh the harm and you were to grant listed building consent, then what we do is we take a photographic record for posterity and send that to the relevant historic archive, so there is a record of that building for future reference. So it is that condition is purely on the Heritage England sort of, advice note. They have quite a lot of documentation on this, and if we do agree to the loss of listed building, it's just recording it for posterity purposes. And the second point, or the first point that you raised, in terms of the impact on the neighbouring properties, well, in effect, you've got the scheme in front of you here, which is the permission that's granted, planning permission for these units. The applicant wouldn't be able to implement fully this scheme because obviously the building sits in approximately this position here, so it blocks the access here. So needless to say, I wouldn't be able to determine, the building sits, maybe if I can just put the highlighter, it might make it a bit easier to see. So the building sits in approximately this position here. So obviously these houses, this permission wouldn't be able to be fully implemented. Obviously you've got these units here that potentially could be, because they've got a separate access off Sutton Road, but obviously these 4 units here would have difficulty. You might be able to get the 1 unit here, but you wouldn't then be able to implement the rest because this building would be in the way. So if members were to refuse the listed building consent, the resultant consequence on this scheme would be you wouldn't be able to fully implement it, and I expect that they would come back with a new application and or provide further justification as to why the benefits outweigh the harm in that instance. There's a number of options they could go, but that's effectively the implication from a decision to refuse listed building consent.
Thank you, Mr Bailey. Can I ask Councillor Brindle to come back first, and then I come to Councillor Cox?
Thank you. I was just going to say that reiterates what Councillor Springett was saying then, that we do need to have a look at both schemes together or at a similar time, so that we can assess the harm or otherwise of one rather than the other, because if we refuse this now, then they'll have to come back with another scheme if they want to go ahead. So sorry, was that what you were going to say?
Okay, thank you, Councillor Brindle. Can I ask Mr Bailey to come back on the point that you've just raised? Thank you.
And I think it's a good point, because I was going to come back on, Councillor Springett raised it. In normal circumstances, you would have both applications running simultaneously. So you would have a decision on both applications and you would consider both applications. As I said, the tests as set out in 16.2 and 66.1 are similar tests, i.e. the duty to conserve. One just says the setting because you're not considering works on the planning application, and the other one considers works. But the tests that you're meant to do are very similar tests as set out in the Listed Building Conservation Areas Act. So unless you're reaching very different conclusions, which I have said tonight, you actually can reach those different conclusions, but you know, we make decisions, or you make decisions based on consistency. So that's an important fundamental component of the planning system. But I 100% agree with you that in normal circumstances, you would run them together. There's no requirement in the Act to say that you have to do that, and therefore you can submit the listed building consent first, the planning permission first. You know, the longer the period that there is between it, you know, there is that issue of inconsistency. So that's why most people would try and run the planning application and the listed building consent together, so you're considering them together, and then there's certainty in terms of the decision-making process. So I can understand where that's arising.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Councillor Cox.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, indeed I struggle with this, but when I read the papers and at 8.10, our heritage officer has said less than substantial harm, I then look at the building. We've heard of what's been done to the building. Regardless of when it's been done, it has been done. And therefore, I hold in high regard the ability to list buildings so that people can indeed visit them, see them, look at the architecture, look at the way they built things, look at the way they structured the heights of roofs in proportion to the whole of the rest of the building, and how it was developed. But that is a carbuncle. Look at it. That is not listed. That shouldn't be listed unless we were doing, this is a building that shouldn't be listed. Because that bit on the right-hand side surely is not something we want to hold in high esteem. The bit on the left that's been added to may well be. But my actual question at the end of my statement is, what would this building be used for if it is preserved? What's going to happen? We can redesign, we can drop 2 houses out, they just won't be able to make the money that they were going to be. We're going to put it in front of 3 other people's houses. What would it be used for in relation to the buildings that will then be around it? I come back to my statement at the last meeting. The people who will live behind it, they're going to look at the back end of a building. But therefore, the whole of the development shouldn't have been given. And if this is so high esteem as a farm, a working farm, and we need all 7 buildings to look at it historically and say, that's why they had that building. They needed a piggery, they needed a barn, they needed this, they need a milk, I don't know. But unless you can look at it in its entirety, what are we preserving? What are we saying this should be stopped, preserved, and so that people can have access to it? Indeed, will people have access to it? So what is it going to be used for if it is preserved? That's my question before I then decide which way I'm going to go.
Thank you, Councillor Cox. I think you've made some relevant points there. Thank you very much. Can I now go to Councillor Springer and then back to... Oh, sorry. Oh, you wanted the question? Sorry.
Could I ask my question? What's the building going to be used for, or don't we know?
Its current use is as a residential use. So I presume if it were to be retained, it would be retained as a residential use. That's its current use.
Sorry, but would it have the amenity that's needed to exist as a residence in its entirety if the proposed light lime green development was going to be around it?
Well, that would be for the developer to work out, because let's say, for instance, if they couldn't get listed building consent, then they would, you know, at the end of the day, it's a lawful dwelling, so there is no sort of stipulations on garden sizes, etc., etc. But, and this is where I get to the point, when you would have to reconsider the scheme, I suspect the developers would have to come back in at some point to reconsider this scheme, because that dwelling is there, you would have to consider the impact of those dwellings on it, because it's a dwelling that would have to remain in situ. But we're not at that position yet. depending on what the decision is or depending how this may unravel as we move forward. So those issues would have to be resolved at some point to look at residential amenity, impact on neighbours, but at the moment it's not a consideration because you're demolishing the building and you know, the officer had previously considered the loss of that building was acceptable when applying those tests, and the fact that this scheme in front of you actually was an improvement on the setting of the listed building. So as set out in your reports, his comments are set out in 8.04 of the attached papers.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. I have Councillor Mumford and then Councillor Harwood.
Just to put something into context, we're not looking at the development around it. We're looking at a listed building in its effect on quite a major heritage asset. We're not looking at what they're going to do with it if we refuse it. And when a conservation officer goes there, he's got three choices. He can grade it that there will be no harm. And obviously, there is nothing, no recourse there. Or the next thing he can do is less than substantial. And the MPPF requires us, if he grades it as less than substantial, to balance between the benefits and the harm. Or he could go to a higher level, which is substantial. So they are the three grades that it's got. They are physical grades. They're not just a description of less than substantial. We have to do something according to the MPPF as soon as he jumps to that level. And that is to balance justifiably, convincingly, the damage to the heritage asset against the benefits. And in this case, it's really, really balanced. That's what we're required to do when we're sat here. But it does say in the MPPF that we should give considerable material weight to the heritage asset. We are not talking about what this will do to an approved development on the site. We are talking about protecting a heritage asset. We would like to know, and we strive to bring heritage assets back into use, and planning applications are actually given, and the MPF actually gives priority on that. But this case, that we're not looking at use, we're not looking at anything more than what is in this paper. And that is, it's less than substantial harm, and do the benefits outweigh the harm? That's what we should be judging, not all these other things.
Thank you, Councillor Mumford. Councillor Springett.
Thank you. I promise this will be the last time I speak. I've got the layout here that was up on the board just now of the new design. Now, a clever architect would say, OK, right, I'll take out plot 6, which is where the little listed building is, and I'll make sure that plots 1 and 5 are designed to look like they're farm buildings. So you would then, around your Bicknor farmhouse, have plots 5 and 1 accessed as they are in like a little group of farm buildings. You then take plot 2, which is in the right-hand lower bit, turn it round, and you can then access plots 7 and 8, 2, 3, 4, 7 and 8 from the other entrance. So you're separating off 5 buildings to the eastern side, completely separate from the farmhouse, and the farmhouse will then sit in a setting of 2 houses, and we ask the developer to renovate that listed building, take off the nasty extension and renovate it. And the whole design on the left-hand side then would still give the appearance of a farmyard if it was well designed. So both plots 5 and 1 could be carefully designed so they keep the character of a farmyard building with the ragstone or whatever. You just lose plot 6. So they'd only actually lose 1 plot, and then you divide it effectively into 2 halves So the farmhouse then still sits in the setting of a sort of farmyard with our little listed building renovated, 2 new houses that are sympathetically designed to be part of a farmyard setting, and the other 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 houses are accessed separately from a different entrance and kept separate. So actually, I think that would maintain the setting of Bicknor Farmhouse even better than what has currently been designed. And they would just lose 1 plot and we keep the building. Perhaps that's a bit of blue sky thinking, I don't know, but I think that could easily be done. So I think it would just require the loss of 1 property, and they'd just have to go away and think outside the box, but I'm saying no more.
Thank you, Councillor Springett. we've had a motion made, it's been seconded. I think we've all spoken enough. I think I'd like to bring things to a conclusion. But just one piece of advice I'd like to seek from Mr. Bailey, first of all. If, as now seems likely, we are going to refuse listed building consent, would it be open to us to include an informative indicating the committee's wish that perhaps a redesigned scheme should be devised which incorporates the retention of this curtilage building, perhaps renovated into a proper or a more acceptable residential use, and to be incorporated into a revised scheme? Is that something that we could do? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I don't think you could do, accepting the fact that it's only informative, because obviously you've had a planning permission that's already been granted, and you're considering work. So as Councillor Mumford said earlier, you know, you are only considering the works, i.e. the demolition of the building, and you'd be sort of straying into sort of the Planning Act here by trying to say redesigning the scheme. Members have some, albeit they've been debated in the courts for many a time, some quite simple guides that you have to do, you know, look at the significance of the asset. And I think, if you don't mind me, Chairman, it is worth pointing out in terms of, you know, because the MPPF does require decision makers to look at the significance of this building. I kind of appreciate where members are going, but to a degree, the significance, and that's what the report sets out, has been lost. I'm not undermining the importance that the MPPF places on retaining such buildings, but if you look at this plan, it does kind of show you what the end result will look like of the buildings that surround this platform. So to a degree, that farmstead appearance has been lost already by previous grants of planning permission. But as long as members consider that in terms of the significance, because the significant parts is an important part to play in the overall consideration. But you're right, you know, where you get to is the duty to pay special regard to the preservation of these buildings. You've had a consideration of the significance. You then go down into looking at the public benefits, and then you weigh those effectively public benefits against the less than substantial harm, and you reach that balancing exercise. So as long as you do that, members, then, you know, as officers, we can defend those decisions. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Do we in fact need to flesh out the reasons for refusal as proposed by Councillor Mumford? And Mr. Mumford, Councillor Mumford, would you like to come back on that?
Yeah, well, we're going to be going down the path of refusal because the benefits as described, in our opinion, do not clearly and convincingly justify the demolition of the building, which would be contrary to paragraph 194 of the MPPF, but I'm sure the officers can help word that.
That sounds very good to me. Thank you. Councillor Holbert?
Sorry, just to add to Councillor Mumford's point, I I actually think that the relationship with the listed farmhouse is still important, because essentially that will be the first building you see when you come into this new development, which is an enclave development. It's not the surrounding estate. It is an enclave, so you will come into that development. The first building you see is the listed farmhouse. And I actually think that despite the fact that the overall farmyard site is being redeveloped, the relationship of this curtilage listed building and the farmhouse remains important, albeit interrupted by new development that's in there, but actually it still makes you feel that you're in a redeveloped heritage setting rather than just a new residential area around a listed building. So I think the juxtaposition remains important, and I think we ought to capture that in some way, that they're not divorced. And I think the two examples come to mind. One is some of the redevelopment at Moat House, where very new development has taken place, yet curtilage buildings for the main Moat House have remained as part of development. It gives you a feel that you're still in that historic setting, even when you're in a new build area. And the other place, which is perhaps even more germane, is just in Church Street, where heritage asset buildings and frontages were incorporated into the redevelopment of the ophthalmic hospital, where it was very modern development, but they kept some of those curtilage buildings, or at least their frontages, within the development, and it has added a certain gravitas and connection to the surrounding conservation area. So I would like if Councillor Mumford and John Perry as a seconder could incorporate something about that juxtaposition.
So I think what Councillor Harwood is saying, something like this building, this curtilage building still adds to the setting of the Grade 2 listed farm house. Even with the development which is going in around it, it still adds to its value.
That's almost a second reason for refusal, isn't it? If Mr. Bailey can draft something up.
Yeah, I'm just kind of trying. It may well be that sort of we just. I think it's one ground of refusal, because you're saying the importance of the. I'm just trying to work out the curtilage listed building still plays an important role in the setting and understanding of the former farmyard. And therefore, you know, so in terms of that context, I'm constructing a sort of a ground, but one ground that wraps up the importance that the public benefits don't outweigh the harm, because it still retains that important functional relationship.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bailey. Right, so are we clear now on what we are voting for? Should I ask Mrs. Snook to no? Oh, okay. Can I ask Mr. Bailey then just to record or just to read out quickly what we are actually voting on?
Okay, what I've got down is that the benefits do not clearly and convincingly justify the demolition of the listed building, and therefore the limited public benefits do not outweigh the loss, the less than substantial harm from the demolition of the curtilage listed building, and the curtilage listed building still plays an important role in the setting and understanding of the former farmyard and its functional relationship. So along those grounds.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Is everybody clear on all of that? Somebody, Councillor Harwood?
Yep, thank you. I just wondered whether into that wording on the second part of the motion, whether we should talk about the the impact on the context of the farm building, the fact of the former farmyard. So it's not just the impact on the listed farmhouse, it is the impact upon the context of the farmhouse, that it was a farmhouse with those curtilage buildings, and there has been an attempt in new development to almost ape a cluster of farm buildings around a central farmyard. Well, the fact that we've still got a heritage asset standing, albeit with a nasty lean-to, I think we just need to capture the word context. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Harwood. Right, I think we're ready now to go to the vote. So can I please have votes in favour of refusing the application for the reasons spelt out by Mr. Bailey? Votes in favour? And votes against? So could I ask for the vote to be read out, please? Thank you.
Chairman, that was refused. 7 in favour of refusal, 2 against and 2 abstentions.
So that application is refused. Thank you very much, members. Do members want to have a break, or would want to carry on with the next application? Carry on? Thank you. Okay. Right. We come to item number 10 on the agenda, and I'll ask Mr. Bailey to present his report, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, I'm just trying to find the application. Excuse me. Yeah. Bear with me. Why is that not on here? Page 9. No, it's not right. Right, sorry about that, members. So this is an application for, it's a council-owned application for internal alterations to create an additional 2 units at first and second floor of the Trinity foyer, which is a Grade 2 listed building. I would add that this is not accompanied by a listed building application on the basis that the Conservation Officer considers that the works, when it was internally divided, were panel divisions and they don't affect the integrity and character of the listed building. So there is no requirement, that's the Conservation Officer's consideration, no requirement for a listed building application that you would normally get for new units, because all the additions internally are all modern additions. So they're just doing shifting around stud partitions, etc. So that's why we haven't got a listed building application on this one, just so to make sure that's clear. Members will know the Trinity foyer. As I said, it's a grey listed former church located in the Holy Trinity Conservation Area. And as I've said, this relates to the reconfiguration of the internal layouts. So this is the building. You can see in its context the front elevation of the building, the side elevations. There'll be no alterations to, as I said, the external fabric of the building. So this is the existing first floor plan. And then this effectively just breaks up the units in terms of how the council are proposing to divide that. You can roughly see principally the alterations come around here in terms of this area here on the first floor as we move forward. So you've got various units here. And this is the existing second floor plan. And this is how the council proposed to divide up that unit. Effectively, it's on where you've got the bigger units, it's effectively splitting some of the bigger units into an individual unit, so they're not quite so large to meet the needs on our housing register. In terms of, I've said, in terms of the no listed building application is required, you will see set out in your report whilst there is no policy for national space standards that the council have adopted at this stage, albeit we are having to assess numerous prior approval applications under national standards, there is no policy requirement, and you can see is set out in this report that the units do, the two smallest studio flats, this is paragraph 6.06 of your report, have floor spaces of just under 33 square metres, where the current standard is 37 square metres. However, notwithstanding this requirement, because the limitations of the listed building, you can't do any external works on the building, you've got to keep the proportions in terms of the windows, etc., etc. It is considered acceptable in this instance that they're slightly below the national space standards in this instance. On that basis, the application is recommended for approval, and I've got nothing further to add, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. We have no public speakers or visiting members, so I'll ask councillors if they want to speak. Councillor English.
Yes, this is in my ward. Holy Trinity has been controversial in the past, and no doubt in relation to a certain proposal for the use of the building, it will be controversial again in the near future. However, this application in itself is just a modest reconfiguration of existing units. It doesn't impact on anything very much internally or externally, so it's just, as I say, an internal reorganisation of some modern separations of space. So I would ideally like the one or two of the units to be bigger, but frankly, as Mr. Bailey said, that really isn't achievable very easily in this context. So this, unlike some other things that are likely to happen to this building in the near future, is not controversial. Therefore, I move the recommendation on the papers.
Thank you, Councillor English. Do you have a seconder? Wow. I don't quite know who was first there, but I think Councillor Mumford. Thank you. Do you want to speak now, Councillor Mumford, or?
I don't think I've got anything to add.
Right. Councillor Cox? Councillor Cox.
I am concerned if we set a standard of 37 square metres, I think we should adhere to it. Because if we have somewhere else in the borough another application that just squeaks in, and someone says, no, it's not 37, therefore it shall not go. I don't want to set a precedent here that we're okay to take 4 square metres off. Because if it's only 2 smallest units being under that, then we need to look and say we should sacrifice 1 unit and make them slightly over, 37.2. Because to squeeze this in, we're going to keep on reducing and keep on reducing. Well, it's only just that. Yes, officer, I was driving at 73 miles an hour, but I wish you would take it into consideration because I was only at 73. Please don't. Come on. If we have a standard, let us at least stick to it so we can say everywhere in this borough is 37 square metres, the minimum. So I really do want us to look at that, and I know what we're passing here, but we shouldn't be able to get away with this if we're going to hold the same flag up and say no because it doesn't conform elsewhere. Thank you,
Councillor Cox. I think it might be a case of every case on its merits, but I'll ask Mr. Bailey to respond to you.
Yeah, just to point out that obviously the National Space Standard is not a standard that is adopted by NBC, but it is a national space standard. We don't have it in our policies. Obviously that will be changing as we're moving forward to the emerging local plan. I raise it because obviously we raise it to other applicants in terms of national space standards, so it's wrong for me to say that we don't obviously use the standard, but actually we couldn't refuse an application by not conforming to the standards because it's not a policy that we have in the local plan. Therefore, if we go back to section 38.6, we must make decisions in accordance with the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. So there wouldn't actually be that fallback position, which we are remedying moving forward. We are remedying, and I'm just pointing out that, you know, obviously the government have acted pretty swiftly on prior approvals requiring national space standards to be adhered to, but we couldn't refuse it that it doesn't comply with the national space standards. So hopefully that's clear, but be assured that we as officers at pre-application meetings with applicants do use the standard. That's why it's clearly been mentioned in the report, because we use that as a gauge measure in terms of making sure that we're meeting sort of government expectations. I think in this case, because of the listed building status, I think, you know, on that basis, yes, you could reduce a unit, but I think what this is looking at is to meet the needs of the people we're housing in this particular building. And I think in this particular instance, I don't personally feel it sets a dangerous precedent for the reasons that's set out in this report. We have flagged it. We're being very clear that it's slightly below that standard. But I think there are justifications in this instance to make that exception, in my personal view, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. I have Councillor Harwood waiting. Can I just ask Councillor Cox to come back? Because I think
I'll be very quick, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, okay.
This is just above 10% that it is under by. Therefore, are we going to say, if we had an application where they were saying, well, I've got 8 units in here, and each one of them is just 10% under, you're almost going to have a whole unit that it is under by. If you're calling it a standard, that is what we hold something to. And you're saying, oh, well, it's all right, it's just, then don't have a standard. Just say whatever you can get in is fine. Don't have a standard there and then go, but in cases we can let it go a bit. Don't have it. And if we've got one coming up, then we should say, we want to hold a light and say we will produce good quality, correct standards with the best we can achieve for the people of our town, of our borough. I just think it may be just 4 square metres. Sort it. Get it right.
Thank you, Councillor Cox. Councillor Harwood.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, Councillor Cox has stolen my thunder in a way, but I actually thought 10% below the National Space Standard was actually quite a lot. And I understand the constraints of the listed building and so on, but still, people still have to live in them. And this is part of a wider malaise. I mean, we look after this site. It's in a conservation area, yet NBC contractors took out the hedge along the frontage in the conservation area in the nesting season. If that had been a private developer had done that, we'd have been down on like a ton of bricks. So I just hope that officers are listening to this who are involved, and there's nothing we can do in planning law as Mr. Bailey's set out, but it's not to say we have to like it. And also, we need to be more empathetic to local residents and to the landscape and to biodiversity and so on when we're undertaking works on sites where we have some control. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hubble. I'll just go to Councillor Brindle, then I'll go to the vote. Thank you.
Can I please refer to other issue 6.06? The current standard is 37, where a shower room is provided. Oh, I'm on, okay. It then goes on to say, this level of floor space is considered acceptable as there are existing bedsits in the building with smaller floor space. Does that mean we've already approved previously for something in order of 33 square metres?
Yes, please. We'd like to answer that, please, Mr. Bailey.
Yeah, because it has a lawful use. We're adding 2 more units over and above the existing lawful units in the site. So, in effect, national space standards are relatively new. They came in, Clive, they came in about a year and a half ago, I think, around then when the standards came in. So everything before that obviously didn't have a standard. So the reasons why also we're saying that that's acceptable, as you rightly point out, is there are other smaller units already in this unit, which is not, there's no control over. So I think what we're doing is they're smaller than the 33 units, so we're not sort of, I can't say compounding the situation, but that's why we consider it's acceptable.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Right, Councillor English once more, and then we go to the vote.
Just very briefly, the original application for the foyer use, which was the use that was granted, dates back to the early 1990s. So it was undertaken under some quite outdated planning law, I should say. I do share Councillor Cox's view that we should be moving towards space standards, and we really should be setting an example ourselves. But it is within the parameters of current planning requirements. So refusing it on that would be quite difficult, which is why I moved it in the first place. But it doesn't mean I don't think we should be doing better. And frankly, we haven't entirely handled this asset brilliantly in terms of some of the works on the site. We do need to do better.
Thank you, Councillor English. I saw Councillor Kimmons waving his order paper. Yep.
Yeah, I've kept quiet all night. I've looked at it, and I come from a social housing background, so I've seen small units. I don't agree with making the units smaller. If you make them any smaller, you might as well just put a fence around it and call it HMP Trinity Foyer, because that's all it'll actually be. It'll be rooms with a bed, a sink, a toilet, and that's it.
Thank you, Councillor Kimmons. Right, we have a proposition, we have a seconder. Can I please have votes in favour of that motion, please? Oh, sorry. And those against? And were there any abstentions? One abstention. So can I ask Ms Stokes to read out the result, please? Thank you.
Yes. Chairman, that application was approved, 9 in favour, 2 against and 1 abstention. Thank you.
Thank you, members. Moving on. We now come to item 11, which is a little bit disappointing, but I'm sure James Bailey has some words of mitigation, and I'm sure these figures have to be seen over a long time period. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I wasn't going to sort of go into any details. The long-term wood one was disappointing. I think it seems that the inspectorate don't apply the same weighted balance that the MPPF says in terms of ancient woodland. We did get a legal review of it in terms of the decision, and you know, the response back from that was we only had about a 50-50 chance, and it's not expedient to spend taxpayers' money on that basis with such a sort of a medium risk. So that's disappointing in the sense that inspectorates don't seem to apply the weight, and that also goes to the issue of the dismissed enforcement notice, which was similarly works in connection that transgressed into the ancient woodland area and covered over soils, etc. That was quite interesting, Unit 3 Lordswood, on the basis of the defined area of a curtilage, which raised some kind of new issues that I think are quite relevant that we're going to raise in the training programme, because I think those are quite key things that we need to take into account when we're doing conditioning. To be very careful of defining what is the curtilage and removing permitted rights for hard standings, because we're getting a lot more prior approval, we're getting a lot more applications that can come forward under permitted development, and I think that has even more of an impact in terms of what defines the curtilage of a building, and it's far more extensive than you may think. Now is not the time to go into that. But that means that when we get applications in sensitive areas, we need to be very careful about making sure we remove certain rights for like hard standing and any other rights that we feel can impact at that time of the application. Otherwise we find, like in this instance, we had no control over what was loss of ancient woodland, which is unfortunate. But as I say, we have to learn from that. We are bringing a paper, if you don't mind me, Chairman, we are bringing a training programme back to this committee, hopefully next time, with a paper as per the Constitution that you need to agree, and some of that will be enforcement training, and some of that will also be some sort of more in-depth training about curtilage and helping you with condition, etc., that might have come around from case law. So apart from that, yes, it's not the best appeal record that we have had, because we have sustained a very good appeal record, and this is, you know, showing that we can't win everything, unfortunately.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. We look forward to the training courses. Does anybody, any councillor, have any comments they want to make on the appeals? No? Oh, sorry. Okay. Right. In that case, members, without any more ado, I'll draw the meeting to a conclusion. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Mr. Bailey and Ms. Snooks, for providing all the backup and the technical expertise. Thank you.